Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow and welcome back to Tech Interviews. As you've probably noticed, Tech Interviews has had a little bit of a semi-retirement, but we've brought the show out of retirement because there's been a bunch of topics I've been keen to bring to the podcast audience. So we've got a short series of shows where we're going to be covering everything from object storage to evolving security and a bunch of other topics. So welcome back. The show's I've dusted off the mic, I've dusted off the Tech Interviews t-shirt, and I hope you enjoy this series of shows. So for now, over to me and the Tech Interviews podcast. Enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, and welcome to another edition of Tech Interviews. So, on this week's show, we're going to be covering something that really caught my attention actually a few months ago when I saw a presentation from today's guest talking about something they were doing in the space of object storage. And kind of what was at the back of my mind was how is it that object storage has gone from something that we maybe initially saw as kind of a tertiary long term archive to actually being the storage that many of us are now considering as our primary approach to the way that we host data and present data to our applications and to our users. So that was kind of thing in the back of my mind. And so today's guest was generous enough to come on the show and share some of his experience in this space. So I'd like to welcome to this week's Tech Interviews, Brad King. Hi, Brad. How you doing?
Doing very well. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss a topic that's clearly dear to our hearts. Glad to have the introduction and appreciate the opportunity.
No, well, you're more than welcome, and thanks for sharing some time with us, Brad. And yeah, I say this is a subject close to our hearts. Let's hope it's close to the listeners' hearts as well, because otherwise, why was we even here? So
Indeed.
Brad, look, but before we jump into our topic, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what it is you do, and some of your background?
So I'm didn't start my career in storage. I was actually fluid dynamics of ships is what my specialty historically was, and that got me into doing HPC and some different things. But I'm one of the co-founders of Scality. We pivoted the business that we were doing from anti abuse and email systems to very large scale storage systems, and so we're excited to be in the storage industry. It's been a little over 10 years now that we've been in the storage industry, and we've seen a lot over the years. Object storage, when we started, was a very new thing, and we did a lot of education. So it's come a long ways since then. And I'm my title is field CTO. I work with our really large customers, and I also keep track of the heartbeat of where the industry is going, and for having an impact on our roadmap as we move forward.
So that's quite an interesting pivot. Actually, I didn't realise about Scality's background. That's quite an interesting change. I've kind of always known you as a player in kind of the storage and data industry. You talked in your introduction about kind of object storage, and I talked about that in my intro as well. And I suppose I do, like most of us do in technology. I assume everybody knows what we're talking about. So maybe as a starter, Brad, if you wouldn't mind, do you want to kind of give us just for those who may not be overly familiar with what we mean when we talk about object storage, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction to what that is and maybe how that differs from kind of file and block storage
Mm.
that maybe most of our listeners are used to?
I think one of the historical reasons we got into the storage industry, one of our customers in North America was actually Comcast. We asked them what could we do to help you with other things once we'd helped them with some of their email security problems, and they said we need a stuff store to store stuff. And I think that introduced to the idea of storage not just as a file system, but as a place to store things. And at that point in time, Amazon S3 had existed, simple storage service, and an API based storage technology, which really object storage in a sense is. We were looking for a new way to interact with storage, and we just followed in that movement. And I think an API-based storage platform is fundamentally what our object storage is. I think one of the unique characteristics of object storage, it's more designed to a get, put, delete interface, and you can replace an object, but you don't make tiny little byte by byte modifications in an object storage. And that's one of the things that makes it fundamentally different. But I think the API nature of interacting with the storage rather than traditional file systems is one of the things that really distinguishes it from traditional file system storage. And we were looking for something new, a way to interact with storage at a very large scale, and that API notion really spoke to us. And I think that's kind of the beginnings of how we get going on our stuff store.
Yeah, and I really like that phrase "stuff store." I think that might be the phrase that I use for object storage from here on in. Just place to put stuff, because I think the reason that kind of caught my attention though was because that it feels like quite a good description of the way that we've looked at objects up until this point. It's somewhere to just put a lot of stuff. And one of the analogies that I've always kind of had in the back of my mind about storage is a car park. The
Mm,
idea of the difference between kind of file and block and object is the difference between a car park and valet parking.
mm,
So in a car park you would go and park your car yourself, and then you'd have to go and find it yourself. So you'd kind of search around, and then you'd find it. Whereas actually in valet parking, you give your car to somebody, they give you a ticket, they go off and they place it somewhere, and when you
mhm,
retrieve it, you give them the ticket, and your object stroke car is returned to you. And I think so. So while they're kind of interesting differences, so that kind of idea of a stuff store, or you talked about kind of API driven and delivering storage at scale. Why is it that then, because people who are using kind of file and block might argue that they can do all those things as well, that I can just
mhm.
put stuff in there and I can do things at scale and I can do things quickly. So what is it that's making object storage kind of become this almost standard point of conversation? Because I suppose, like most people, my kind of one of my first exposures to objects was the discussion you because you talked about S3 before. The idea that actually a lot of the cloud vendors use object as kind of at least as a strategy for the way they deliver storage. However you see that storage, there tends to be quite a lot of object behind it. But I mean, why is that? What's object doing differently that is addressing the challenges that file and block just isn't doing, kind of in the modern world that we're trying to operate in?
So I think that there were a number of reasons that object storage became to be a thing in the cloud space. I think one of the reasons was the POSIX file system standard has a lot of things about it that make it very complicated to do at a very large scale with multiple users. Having the ability to have a lock on a file and this massive tree structure, being able to move things around all over the place in the file system. There's a lot of file system characteristics that make it very difficult to imagine having a file system for everyone on Earth that works in just the same way. There's all kinds of problems you can get into with a file system. So, Object, in a sense, changed the rules about what you could and couldn't do, and it made it easier to scale the system. And I think those were advantageous for cloud companies to be able to do something at a planetary scale. But then I think we all began to see that there were some really nice things about that. Having a unique URL, a universal resource locator, indicate identifier that's unique on the planet Earth is a really nice thing, because an object that's been stored then can be accessed by anyone anywhere if they have access to that object. That's something that's really, really different from a file system. No one would imagine storing a file in a file system and thinking anyone on Earth can get access to my file. There's protocol problems. There's access rights problems. There's all kinds of things that just don't work at that scale. And as a matter of fact, the early days of S3, and I think that's probably still a lot the case, just static web content was one of the things that you could do with an object storage platform. If you use an Amazon bucket for a file for a web server, you'll end up with actually a quite nice performing web server for static web content, and people still do those kind of things. So kind of that mix of the web service and the storage world together in one thing became a very interesting approach for a lot of people that were storing data that was in the end going to be consumed over the public internet.
So, and that's an interesting point, because as I said before, my my introduction to object storage wasn't necessarily the cloud providers, but that's kind of the place that I've seen it talked about the most. For
Mm,
all the reasons actually you've just talked about, because by its definition, it's about scale. Like as you said, it's about putting that piece of data, that piece of information into a layer of storage that can be accessed from pretty much anywhere at
mm,
any time without some of the problems that are associated with doing that on file and block. And anybody who's tried to do things like DFS or try to stretch array based storage over distance appreciates the problems. It's not that it
mm.
can't be done, but appreciates the problems with doing it, because you're almost trying to make something that's not designed to do something. You're trying to build things to overcome those restrictions,
Right,
and I think that in itself comes with its own problems. There's some great solutions that do that kind of thing, but they are still kind of patching over some
right.
fundamental issues. Um, but of course, for many people who listen to this show or watching this show, they're kind of working in enterprise IT. They're IT pros. They're making decisions about data strategy. So while that seems useful at kind of cloud scale, so for people developing at cloud scale, for cloud providers, for service providers, we were talking before we started recording about, obviously, you similar to me. You have a lot of conversations with enterprise. So while I've seen some use cases around object storage and enterprise, and I'm seeing more and more enterprise vendors making objects something that they can use easily inside of their own current applications, whether that's
Mm,
backup providers providing object as a storage repository, or whether it's storage providers using object as kind of an archive layer within their main SSD or whatever. What are some of the conversations you're having with enterprises about, or what are the problems you're seeing in enterprise where object is a good fit and is maybe
mm.
solving some of those problems for them?
I think one of the things we've seen, and it kind of fits with the stuff store notion, is that so much of the data that's being stored today is in fact data that we want to store and retain for some profitable use later. And a classic example would be a media asset, or, for instance, in the medical world, a medical image. And you don't really want to store a medical image and see it be corrupted or transformed over time. You really want to store that medical image and come back to it 10 years from now, and it will be the same. And that's one of the notions with object storage is this is, I store something and then I retrieve it and I don't change it every day. And the that can be perceived by some as a weakness of object storage, but in a sense, it's also a strength. So having things that I store this piece of data and it's always there and it's always the same whenever I need access to it. So we have um, assets, in a sense, digital assets that we've put on a shelf, and then we can go and get them wherever we need them, and we can rely on the fact that they're just like they were when we put them there. And having data protection schemes have become more sophisticated with object storage. So I think keeping your data safe is one thing. Another component is very interesting is that traditional file systems have a very limited amount of metadata that you can associate with a file, and it depends a little bit on the particular file system. But sometimes that's only limited to the rights to the file. You have a mask that says, okay, this is read write for me. No one else has access. Read write for me in the group, and it doesn't go much further than that. Object storage has metadata that can be directly associated with every object, and so I can tag a piece of data with this was the the project that we did in Indonesia in 1973, and these were the characteristics of the project. So you can put interesting data that makes your piece of information more interesting and more useful to other people, to guarantee that that data it stays with my piece of data. And that's something pretty unique to object storage, the fact that the metadata travels with the data, and so you don't have to worry about a separate database keeping all those things in sync. Metadata comes together with the data. So I think that's one of the things. And we're seeing customers gradually getting more and more enthusiastic about the data of idea of tagging their data, making sure that they're disciplined about having all that information up to date. I think one of the hottest topics right now that's really moving the needle is ransomware. I mean, the world is terrified of ransomware, and rightfully so. The fear of having a large scale file system, and the bigger they get, the bigger the risk. Um, you have a corporate IT manager that has really high level access to a file system. His laptop gets his or her laptop gets um, infected with a virus, and that virus, the laptop sits there running and having access to a file system, and just happily corrupts data hour after hour, and turning precious data into encrypted, useless bytes. And that concern, not that it's impossible in an object world, but typically the rights associated with getting access to an object are very separate from the local user. So it's a lot more work for a system to encrypt data. And encrypting data can't be simple little changes to a file. It's actually replacing the data. So you have a stronger notion of keeping data from getting corrupted. So we're seeing that more and more, and you're seeing new functionalities being added into object platforms like object locking, read-only versioning, and things like that do a much better job of protecting data and not letting anyone and everyone being able to touch pieces of data. So I think data security is definitely moving the bar in that space.
Yeah, and so is a lot of that, because interesting the way you talked about ransomware there and kind of data security, and a couple of things in what you just said actually. That idea of making the data or the information that it creates more valuable by being able to assign more information to go with that information,
Hmm.
if that makes sense, kind of in that metadata to conversation, but also because data is becoming such a valuable asset, I think, for
Hmm.
most enterprises. A lot of this about how we store it and how we secure it, and how we understand what we have. Are they kind of at the heart of what's starting to drive this in the enterprise? Because I'll be honest, I'm not. For the enterprises that I talk to, I'm not seeing lots of them falling over themselves to deploy object storage, and
Right.
that's not because there's anything wrong with object storage in the enterprise, but I do think there's an element of perhaps they just don't understand why it might have some benefit for them. So some of those things you've talked about there, are clear benefits. The idea that we can
Hmm.
understand our information better because we can assign more information to the information, and we can secure it and scale it better. And we can make it more portable because of object storage.
Hmm.
But I mean, I mean, is that a fair question, or is that just kind of some of the conversation I'm having? Do you see that there's a challenge with enterprise understanding where object storage might bring some value to them? What are some of the kind of pushbacks, or maybe even misunderstandings that the enterprise has with object? What are some of the things that are stopping? I appreciate while there is adoption, what are some of the things that are stopping object adoption for enterprises?
I think in many ways, what has been stopping it for a number of years is that we typically don't, there's exceptions to that, but we use applications that store data on a file system. And if applications don't understand object storage, uh, why would an enterprise exert effort to use a system that their applications don't understand? And so we're definitely seeing a transition in the application space, and that's definitely true in medical imaging. It's definitely true in the media industry. A classic tool in the media industry was the media asset management system, where you associate metadata typically using a database with a file system. And little by little, we're seeing that being replaced with an object store. And enterprise begin to see the utility of that, because now if I have an on-premises object storage, I put my data there. If I decide tomorrow I want to be hybrid public cloud, I don't really have to change anything. I just point my data, my asset management system, a different place. So we're certainly seeing some of that. And when we started, we were very enthusiastic about object storage and found that the industry said, "Huh." Uh, our applications don't work with that. So we developed a native file system interface, and little by little, that's been very successful in its own right. But little by little, the applications are starting to move to where we hope they would. And so backup systems, almost all major backup applications today use file system excuse me, object interfaces as an option. A lot of media tools, anything that's using data in massive quantities and storing data, that there's definitely a trend to move in that direction, because it's, all the things we've talked about, the portability, the the ability to enrich with metadata, the ability to know that you can point to a single place and have access to that data, and the ability to work with multiple public clouds and on premises for an application. It simplifies application developers' lives. So I think industry is, there's part of industry, databases, things like that. They're going to be using file systems, but
So are you seeing? Because it's interesting, and I think this is true of technology in just in technology in general, not just in the enterprise. That sometimes it's about multiple things coming together that
hmm,
start to drive an interest. And we'll touch on kind of something that you guys kind of launched relatively recently. This kind of Artesca
hmm,
solution. Hope I pronounced that correctly. And we'll kind of touch on why you've done that in a second. But I suppose this idea of multiple things coming together, which are now starting to
hmm,
drive a way we think differently about storage. So, it's if I'm an enterprise person listening to this, I'm the storage admin or storage manager, or I'm a CTO even. I'm
hmm.
making these kind of strategic decisions, and if I'm looking at my organization and the way I'm building my applications or the way I'm managing data, and I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, is object storage for me? What are the kind of things what are the kind of things you look at in your enterprise infrastructure to make you think that actually now might be a good time to consider objects? What are some of the things you'd look for?
I think indeed there's a number of transitions going on. Clearly, one of them is this everything as a service, which we could go along add to that, serverless applications, environments like Kubernetes environments, um, computing of that nature. What we end up having is data is being looked at and consumed at many different places in the enterprise. Rather than having a system that stores the data and then consumes the data, I have an application with file system behind it. Now we start to have we have an application that may be end user facing, that's accessing the data. And then we've got a machine learning application that's accessing the same data. And then we have a big data analytics application that's trying to understand users' behavior. And then we have another system that's doing logging. And that might all be the same data. So you've got data that's being now looked at by a number of different applications, consumed with different rights. And those kinds of things are extremely difficult to do well with a file system interface, because it may not be the same groups of people. You want to have subtly different access rights, and also applications that can't mount the file system for various reasons. A serverless application, it's quite tricky to mount a file system. So those things are getting to the point where people really recognize the interest of storing the data and having it for another application. But if I have to spend too much time providing access to another application, it's just too much work. And, we've always talked about the siloed nature of file systems, and I think if you're if you're an enterprise customer that feels frustrated about the siloed nature of your data, object storage is definitely something to think about, because the object interface with an API is a very good way of quickly breaking up the silo notion of data storage.
Yeah, and it sounds like from the way you're describing that it almost gives you the opportunity to have that data, because there's a difference, isn't there? There's a subtle difference between data and information. Data
Mm,
is kind of the ones and zeros. What we do with it then becomes the information, the thing that has value. And it sounds like from the way you were discussing that what object storage allows us to do at scale and at performance as well, because one of the things that's been leveled at object storage in the past has been, well, isn't object storage slow? But obviously, technology is changing that, and we're
mm,
seeing more and more high performance object. But we're seeing that. It sounds to me like, as long as we've got all that data in one place, what object allows us to do, its flexibility allows us to do better than we could do with file or block, is that we can almost make that data look like different information depending on the requirement. So we can
Mm.
kind of not we're not manipulating it, we're not changing it, but because we know more about it, you know, you talked about that kind of metadata before. We could almost have that I might have one requirement for that piece of data, you might have a different requirement, and because the applications can present that same data as differently, we can both attain value from it. Even if the value is different, we can still get value from the same bit of data. Does that make sense? Have I kind of have I got that idea?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think applications that were an end user will. I want to look at my data. My like my bank statements, the PDFs of my bank statements. That's me interacting with the system, but another system is going to want to look across many users access data with very constrained access rights. So those all those kinds of things play into the equation of having kind of a matrix of access to data. But also you have I think just the notion of being the whole Kubernetes serverless world, um, having data available in a pod that's doing computing becomes a pretty tricky problem if you have tens of pods all wanting access to the same file system to make sure that they don't mess each other's data up, and that's where an object interface becomes very interesting because you're just making API calls, and I think we're seeing the what's called the cozy the cloud object storage interface um, coming out in the Kubernetes world, and we're excited that there's going to be standards there. But being able to just have access data from a serverless world and saying I want to access something, have a look at it, persist my result, and not worry about storage. I think it's a pretty interesting new notion. The idea that I can just request a piece of data and I can persist something without having any idea what's the file system behind it, what's the model, and I think that goes along a lot with this notion of cloud and everything as a service, but just persisting information, as you said, rather than the bits and bytes. Is that a 500 kilobyte file? I'm just persisting information.
Yeah, and I think that's hugely important, kind of as we architect modern solutions, modern data platforms. You know, we need that portability. You know, we don't want to be tied to something specific. We Because, as you said, you know, that kind of serverless or that Kubernetes world that we operate in, containers world that many of us are starting to move to. You know, the whole point of that is almost kind of portability, rapid scale automation. You
Mm.
know, and if we're tied to things that don't support that kind of mode of operation, that's going to be quite difficult for us. You know, again, we're going to be kind of as we talked about before, things like DFS. You're kind of overcoming a problem by trying to patch something over the top of it to
Mhm.
overcome limitations. So, well, look, we're kind of coming to the end of our recording time here, and I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about kind of Scality as a company. You know, we've talked a lot about Object and where it may fit in the enterprise, and why Object is becoming increasingly pervasive in the way it's used.
Mm.
So what is it that you guys are doing in terms of helping that you know today's enterprise to look at objects, to understand it, and potentially to adopt it?
So I think one of the things we did, which is kind of the reverse side of the coin, we did make file system interfaces available on the same technology that allowed people to live in both worlds at the same time. And I think, you know, tape has been dead for how many years is it now? File system will probably be dead for a similar length of time. We're going to be living in these worlds for a long time to come. So having those options is one of the things that we did. We do a certain amount of education also with object storage. I think one of the things that we're seeing that's pretty fascinating is the object storage as an as a service in offering inside of a corporation. Corporations that don't want to move to public clouds, they're saying, okay, we want to be able to offer object storage internally, and people will consume it. So one of the things that we had to do to make that more interesting in an enterprise world was do things like quotas. You know, the Azure's and Azure Blob, uh, Amazon, putting quotas on storage is anathema to them. They want you to store as much as you can and have a very bad end of the month when you go, oh, you know, the sticker shock with oh my goodness, that's really expensive. Enterprises don't want that. So we had to add quotas to the S3 platform and a lot of tools so that the people people could have a good notion of who's consuming the storage, because it's a wonderful thing for developers and people that consume storage to no longer have to ask the IT department for, I need 10 more terabytes. Oh, I need 5 more terabytes. And you have purchase orders, purchase requests, things like that. But you have to control it. You can't just let people run wild with that. You can have petabytes of storage. So I think those are some of the things. And the other one is that the expectation has really gone up that if the IT department is going to be providing an as a service offering for something like object storage, the the bar has been set by the likes of the Azures and the AWSs and the Googles of the world, having your data always online, always available, having a quality of service that's reliable, that puts pressure on the IT departments. And so that's one of the things we've really worked hard on, to make sure that the storage can be online all the time. Being able to have 24-hour downtimes these days are just not things that people are willing to accept anymore. So IT departments are really being asked to raise their level of of you know service level agreements, I would say, internally to their customers. So helping customers that we have in that space has become really important as well for us.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I suppose it's so much of this is true across enterprise IT anyway. In that,
Mm,
actually, you talked before the Azures, the AWSs, the GCPs. What those guys have done is start to change the way that we expect to consume technology
mm,
inside of the enterprise. The problem with that is lots of the things that the enterprise is built on don't really allow us to do that, and
right,
that's
right.
why, and I think that's why we're starting to see, as you guys are doing, you're bringing object storage to the enterprise, and you're doing some interesting things that not only are bringing object as was to the enterprise, but
Mm,
also looking at how you can take advantage of object in these kind of new modern working models that we've got, whether that's containers, whether that's full portability at cloud-like scale.
mm,
It sounds like they're the kind of things that you guys are bringing to the market.
right.
So, well, look, Brad, as kind of we get to end of our recording time here, I always like to ask people, if people are listening to this and want to understand a little bit more about object in general, or understand a little bit more about what Scality are doing and how they might be able to help,
Mm.
what's a good way to do that? And maybe is there a good way to kind of come and hassle you on social media as well?
Sure. I think a foot in the door, maybe with the object space, will be the Artesca technology, which we've introduced kind of to at the starter kit kind of end of the system, instead of the really big iron, create your own Google GCP on your on premises. The Artesca is a starter in. So visiting our website, certainly my first name, last name at scality.com will get you my email address. That may be the very easiest way to get a hold of me. But subscribe to our Twitter feeds. Scality's Twitter feeds is one of those things. A lot of things on the web. We're also present in some open source projects that we've done. Metal Kubernetes, which is a distribution that allows us to deploy our technology on top of Kubernetes. There's some places that you can cross paths with us.
Yeah, and just actually just pick up on something you talked about, because when I kind of saw your guys present, that kind of led to us having this conversation. Artesca was something that was talked about a lot, and I think it is just worth remembering. One of the things that often we've seen, certainly in the medium size enterprise or the lower end of large,
Mm,
has been one of the barriers to adoption of object has been scale.
mm,
Because for a lot of object vendors, they do start but big. You're starting at
mm.
50, 60, 100 plus terabytes.
Right.
And actually simplifying that model a little, because object has a lot of benefit for all kinds of organizations
Hmm.
because of the things you've talked about. It's not just about ways of storing massive amounts of data,
Right.
it's about storing data in a way that's more appropriate for the way that some of our technology needs to run inside of the enterprise. So making that something that is in a smaller, more bite-sized consumable lump has
Right.
some real value. So,
Right.
so I think, if people are looking at this and are concerned that, maybe object has been outside of what they've been able to do in the past because maybe they
Right.
don't have the scale, then I would definitely recommend that take a look at the Scality site, find out a little bit more about Artesca, and how that might fit. So there you go. There's my free plug for you there, Brad, at the end. And I'm not even
Thanks.
I don't get paid for this. That was just a free plug based on something that had interested me from the event that I saw. But
Thank you.
Brad, look, really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure.
It's been a great chat, and I've really enjoyed it, and I've understood a little bit more about where object sits in the enterprise. So Brad, for now, thanks for being on Tech Interviews, and hopefully get you back at some point in the future. But thanks for being a guest. Thank you.
Very good. Pleasure to be with you.
Welcome back to Tech Interviews, and I hope you enjoyed this first in this short series of Tech Interviews specials. For show notes, pop over to techstringy.com. We'll also find all of our previous Tech Interviews episodes. If you've got an idea for a show or would like to appear as a guest, then why not email me at podcast@techstringy.com. And to make sure you catch future episodes of Tech Interviews, then why not subscribe? You can subscribe in all good homes of podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and for the video version of the show over on YouTube. So until next time, thanks for watching.